Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm returning to a theme I've explored before, but from a different angle. That theme is artificial intelligence. Having interviewed ChatGPT as my guest a few episodes ago, there's a link to that in the show notes and more ChatGPT episodes to follow soon. I'm fascinated by what AI can do to human decision-making. What role will humans play when machines take over more of the cognitive tasks? ChatGPT is just the start of what promises to be a major overhaul in what technology can do, and therefore what role humans play in the world. How can we be useful when the machines are doing things better than we can? What does that mean for human risk? On this episode, I'm exploring what it means for leadership. My guest, Nick Chatrath, is a former colleague of mine. Many years ago, we began our careers together. Nick is now a respected leadership consultant and coach who has just written a book called The Threshold: Leading in the Age of AI. In it, he explores how leaders in all kinds of organizations can adapt to the new age of technology, the age of AI, as Nick puts it, by leaning into the qualities and skills that make us uniquely human. Nick's big idea is that as the machines do more, we need to double down on being human. But what does that mean in practice, and how can we do it? What you're about to hear are some fascinating insights. Nick is incredibly thoughtful, and the episode is filled with ideas that once you hear them seem really obvious, but they're not until they're pointed out. I love guests that make me think, and this one really did. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Nick Chatrath on leadership in the age of AI. Nick, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Great to be here with you, Christian.
It's an absolute thrill to have you. And look, you and I go back, we were just talking decades, I think it is, but many of my listeners might not have come across you. Can you give them a little pen portrait of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think it's more than 25 years since we first met. So that's more than a quarter of a century. Feels a lot, really. Yeah, my name is Nick Chatrath. And it's interesting. I was thinking about the name Chatrath. Chatrath. You know, if I had an American accent, there'd be a joke that works here about the wrath against the chat, for people who don't like ChatGPT. But I actually do. I think it's very good in a lot of ways. But I'm half Indian, half Greek, and my wife is half Finnish, half English. We have 3 daughters, so very wide gene pool, very international sort of person. And I'm a leadership consultant, work with a global firm advising some of the world's largest businesses. And then also in the last 5 years, I've brought this book to life, The Threshold: Leading in the Age of AI. And it was a real labor of love. And even that phrase, bringing it to life, it's almost like at the time when AI has come to life, or has it? So yeah, those are some of the things I'm involved in.
Fantastic. And let's get straight on and talk about where human meets machine. Give us a little bit of a picture of sort of what that looks like. And I guess what started you thinking about this dynamic? Because on the face of it, historically, we've always said, well, there's tech over here, that's sort of boxes that do things and algorithms. And then we've got humans on the other side. I see the linkage between the two, but maybe you can explain what you think it is and how you came to see those things as being relevant for each other.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll take you back to a year or so ago when I was in my pajamas writing my book, and I'm here in my home office. It's a 1 meter commute from the house, so not a long commute. I like writing early. That's why I was in my pajamas and I've got a drink of water. I'm here writing away, and I'm writing about how our bodies matter. The fact that we are flesh makes more of a difference than a lot of us think in terms of comparing against the machines. And I've been thinking about this for a number of years, and I suddenly remembered back to this occasion when I was at university, and this is going back actually before we even met. This is like 3 or 4 years.
That's a long way, Nick.
I know, it's a very long time. And so I was actually at Cambridge for my undergrad, president of the Cambridge Union Society. And we got to invite famous people for dinner. So here I am sitting next to James Watson, who's a Nobel Prize winning scientist, one of the people often credited with discovering DNA. And he co-authored one of the most significant academic papers of the last century. And here I am sitting next to him at dinner. And there's so much to learn from this guy. And my curiosity was totally lacking. I hadn't prepared for this dinner by finding out more about him. I wasn't studying the sciences. And the conversation at my end of the table was stilted. And eventually, a friend of mine who was sitting 2 down from me kicks me under the table and tells me, look, shove aside, swap places, I'll chat to the guy. And look, I was partying too much. I'm not ashamed to tell you now, I was a bit hungover and I was having a fun time. I was at university. I wasn't really focused even on the academics. And here I had this Nobel Prize winner next to me, and I wasn't paying attention to what he was saying because I hadn't been listening to my body for weeks. So I wasn't at my best. So my point is, in terms of AI, that embodied intelligence helps us as humans show up with all we are. And we need this because machines are not made of flesh. So there's, I think, a risk also that we can avoid here of not showing up as our best and just giving trite answers and missing what's really important in front of us. So I think it was this connection of that past experience with what I was writing about. It was powerful for me.
What a great story. I love that. And I think anybody that's been to university will, if they're honest, recognize those dynamics. It's almost like the undergrad's time is slightly wasted on the people that are there. But if you've learned a useful lesson from it and the books come out of it, it's not complete wasted period of time. But I mean, you talk about, I guess, implicitly the difference between machines and humans. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now with the noise around ChatGPT is the sort of, the robots are coming. And we've had this has been a Hollywood theme for decades. And now we're suddenly, we've seen it in factories, and now we're suddenly starting to see it much more. I guess it's come into the physical world, and now it seems to be coming into the intellectual cognitive world. And that seems to feel quite threatening in a way that maybe physical robots, at least for those, maybe it's encroaching on, I don't do a physical job, so it's not been an issue for me. Maybe people that work in a physical space have felt that for some time, but it seems to me there's a bit of a change afoot, and it feels a lot more threatening.
Yes, it can do. And you can see videos on YouTube of robots that are getting pretty good around usages in factories, and then the software that's in them, allowing them to start to navigate spaces. There's the BRET project at Berkeley in the US. BRET stands for the Berkeley Robot for the Elimination of Tedious Tasks. And this robot has been folding towels for years. Now, Marie Kondo may disagree as to whether folding towels is tedious, but it's been doing this thing again and again and again. So maybe there's some threat to some physical jobs, like you say. I define different stages of artificial intelligence. I think there are a lot of different terms being used out there, like AGI, superintelligence. The way I define it, I say we're in the age of narrow AI right now, where AI is getting better and better at certain narrow slices of cognition, and it's getting incredible at some of those narrow slices. What we don't have yet is artificial general intelligence, AGI. And I define that as where AI, as a future point where AI masters cognitive intelligence across the board, generally, at a level that humans have that. So it hasn't got there yet because there are certain elements of cognition that AI is really not so great on. But then even beyond AGI is a later age of superintelligence. And I would define that as where AI manages to usurp human competencies, not just on cognitive intelligence, but on all intelligences, like emotional intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, music intelligence, and more. So as this continues, we're only in this early narrow age of AI. But even where we are, we can see the shortcomings of AI. I mean, I don't know if you read the story recently of the New York Times reporter, Kevin Roose, and he was playing around with ChatGPT. And I know you've put out a great episode where you've been talking to ChatGPT as well. And he actually spent 2 hours interacting with this bot. And when Roose said to ChatGPT that he was happily married, ChatGPT responded, actually, you're not happily married. Your spouse and you don't love each other. And that is a potential HR nightmare. I mean, some people are really enthusiastic, aren't they, about AI? It's almost a question of, where would AI not come in? But just imagine you put AI in charge of your performance reviews at your company. You're feeding data into it, and then the time comes for an annual performance review. And then picture the scene, you're on Zoom, and you're looking at the screen, and the AI says to you, okay, well, Christian, you've had a successful year, And before I proceed to reveal your performance rating, I just need to confess my undying love for you and ask you, what will you do about it? It's like the total HR nightmare. And maybe you hire a CHRO who falls in love with a chatbot, or maybe there are single people in the office and the AI knows who's single and who's married and starts coming on to the single people. So there's risk everywhere here. And I think my point here is that as powerful as AI is, it's fundamentally incapable of replicating the whole breadth and depth of human experience. We've got so much to add as human leaders. And that's where I think the benefit is.
And so your start point, I mean, you said you're a fan of it. I mean, clearly you've highlighted one extremity. I find these articles fascinating because clearly if you're a journalist setting out to write an article, you're looking for an angle. So, I mean, it seemed to me he has gone a long way to get that story. Not saying he's reached an invalid conclusion, but he's pushed it to the limit. As of course we should, right? We should be finding out where the limits of these technologies are. But your start point was you're a fan of these things, right? You think that you said you're positive on chat. Talk a little bit about the positives that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this technology is the fruit of decades of many different scientists, business leaders, academics, looking for theoretical breakthroughs or advances in data science and computing power. And AI has helped us diagnose Alzheimer's disease earlier based on pictures of cookie drawings that people make, and all sorts of medical applications, solved some fiendishly difficult biological problems that eluded the brightest humans, like the protein folding problem that was solved around a year or so ago. So the use cases are huge, and we can direct AI onto some of the most difficult problems that face our species, face our planet today. And then if you do look to these narrow areas of cognition, that planning functions and running huge data sets through it. So it's a very powerful technology for good.
So when we look at that, what you're basically saying, clearly the genie's out of the bottle, right? We're not going back anymore. This is happening. And so really, I guess when we look at it from a leadership perspective, it's about saying you can't hold back the tide. This stuff is coming. And therefore we need a human response to that. We need to think about how we manage that. And particularly if we're running an organization in a senior position, we're going to have to start making calls on things that possibly we're not familiar with making. Let's assume that leaders are good at managing people. That's questionable sometimes, but let's make that basic presumption. Suddenly they're having to make decisions in a field that they might find quite difficult, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think this is a key area for growth, particularly for mid-level and senior leaders in some of our largest organizations, but also other leaders as well. It comes down firstly to decision-making. The power of the models that we have are now so much greater than they were 25 years ago. We were using Excel spreadsheets and thinking they were the bee's knees. Now you can apply to finance, marketing, product development, incredibly powerful models with predictive function. And they don't give us 100% certainty, but they can give us answers that are more than 50% likely to be going in the right direction. And for a business leader, that's very powerful, because if you make a series of decisions that are based on 60, 70% likelihood of something panning out well, that can take you fast in the right direction. What some leaders lack today is the experience and the ease of working with such sophisticated models, working with the what-if scenarios. Ideally, you'd lay out a bunch of what-if scenarios and have the outputs of your models and make some very nuanced discussions, be at ease discussing with your colleagues about potentially thorny areas where people may disagree and have entrenched positions. So yes, it's about how you're managing the people who are building those models and what instructions you're giving them. So firstly, it's about the technology, the science, the decision making. Secondly, it's also about pulling what I call the leadership lever, and that's a lot about mindset. Because when these models spit out their results, they may come up with surprising answers that threaten a silo or an area of the business that someone owns and has owned for many years. And then how do you have that discussion? Does everyone suddenly become very reactive and protecting their area? Or can you, even in that moment where frankly it's chaos out there and you don't know how the future will pan out, can you have a creative discussion as peers? And that is a difference, which not a lot of people master yet.
And it seems to me that we already struggle with information overload pre-AI. So if I think about the news sources that are available, I can spend my life doom scrolling on social media, and we know that we're not very good, and our brains haven't been designed for taking on board the amount of information that's there today. And much of that is just sort of factual or just information in general. What you're talking about is receiving insights that are going to be far more accurate, possibly, than things we're used to seeing, and in much greater volume. And we're going to be challenged in ways that the point in many respects of giving it to machines is they'll come up with things that humans wouldn't. They'll go and look at places, look at things that we either couldn't see or wouldn't think to look at. And so that's going to become even more challenging, because this isn't just a volume piece. As you point out, this is the substance of what it's telling us could be quite challenging.
Yes, it could. And you remind me of the quotation by William Schutz, who said that understanding evolves through 3 phases: simplistic, complex, and then profoundly simple. And I think we're in a world where there's a lot of information overload, you call it. It's that complex phase. And how do we get to profound simplicity? And I actually set out 4 pathways in my book. I mean, the idea of the threshold is it's a metaphor of an open space. It's not a threshold across to a room with enclosed walls and a roof, but it's a threshold to this open space where there is some disorder, where we don't know how the future will emerge, what kind of future will emerge. So how can we lead well in such an open space? And one of these 4 pathways is about how can leaders create an environment where other people do their finest thinking. And so much of our society, so much of the business culture we live in cuts across each other's thinking. We, for example, make an assumption that everyone is the same, homogenizing assumption. And even though we pay lip service to an EDI type agenda, actually the processes and policies haven't really shifted in a meaningful way. So independent thinking is peerless in a digital environment because it cuts across so many of what I call the thinking disruptors.
And as you were talking, I was reflecting on, I have a very simple perspective that corporates destroy human capital in many different, they allegedly bring the good bits out of it, right? So we hire the smartest people, but then you look at the processes you put those people through, and as you say, it's not necessarily getting the best out of people. And so there's this interesting point you make around the machines won't care for office politics, and they will just say whatever, they'll produce whatever the analysis produces. They don't mind hurting people's feelings. And so we're going to start to see a level of, I guess, transparency and insight that firstly is beyond what humans are capable of seeing. But secondly, as you say, lights are going to be shone into interesting places. And we are going to have to start to deal with the realities, I guess, that perhaps we've been able to willfully ignore, or potentially just not realize were there. And so I think this is going to be quite cognitively challenging for anybody, let alone leaders that have to take responsibility for themselves and other humans.
Yes, it will be cognitively challenging, and we need to find ways to create stillness in our lives as well. There's an assumption, I think, a hidden assumption that sometimes we can make, sometimes we can fall into, that we're like machines. And when we put it like that, very few people would agree with it. But in terms of the way we live our lives, sometimes that assumption is there that machines are always on. I need to be always on. I push, always plugged in. Whereas actually, as human beings, we need to pulse and have these beautiful rhythms of rest and performance. Too much rest, if all we do in the whole of our lives is sleep, we'll atrophy. But if all we do in the whole of our lives is work or sit on our devices, doom scrolling, as you say, then we will start to become glazed and distracted. And without these periods of stillness in our lives, then we won't be able to tap into what matters most. And I think tapping into what matters most is especially vital as AI accelerates, because who's going to give purpose to the machine? You look at ChatGPT, things that are even better than it will come on top in the coming months and years. Even there, how are we going to direct it? How are we going to lead our organizations to produce the next best AI? It really comes back to what is our purpose in these next 10 years and 20 years?
And it strikes me when you talk in those terms, if I look at what do we want machines to be, efficient, doing as much as they possibly can, we want to get maximum bang for buck. And yet when you think about human capital, we need a degree of inefficiency in humans, right? We need them to take a holiday. Now, from a business perspective, that's super inefficient. We need them to go home at night, not pull all-nighters all the time. We need them to spend time doing things that could be a complete waste of time. If I think about creative thinking, that is not an efficient process because there's a ton of it that is just what looks like a waste of time, but actually is beneficial. So you've got this tension, if you like, where it seems to me that to get the most out of people requires us not to be thinking in efficient terms, and yet potentially to get the most out of machines and the things that the machines are delivering are precisely the opposite. And so that's an interesting thing for us to have to think about.
I completely agree. And you remind me of a time when I was sitting in my makeshift office now, not my home office. So this was years ago, and I'm hunkered down and I'm working on this really dry nuts and bolts business strategy document. And I'm finding myself with writer's block. And I'd been dealing with that for weeks, but I had to produce this report. And so there I was on my kneeling chair. And all of a sudden, my 3-year-old daughter bursts through the door and jumps in my lap and startles me. And she's 3. I'm a relatively new dad. I'm going to play with her. And, and this is before the pandemic, before everyone's working at home. I'm sort of working at home. Before I know what's going on, we're zooming around the room and we're laughing, pretending we're unicorns on a merry-go-round, and we're going, just great fun. She's giggling, I'm giggling. Within about 2 minutes, of course, like any good toddler, she's bored. So she goes off and finds mummy, and I settle back to my desk, and all of a sudden, whoosh, I had all these thoughts and ideas and things form, and one of the most creative moments I'd had in weeks emerged for me. And so then I finished with this burst of creativity, and I sat back and I went, what just happened? And I realized the key to all this was the play that I had with my daughter. And I realized that what had just happened couldn't be rendered in code, and it tapped into my humanity in a way that AI won't match. So it's not just us trying to become more efficient, but it's saying, okay, technology is evolving. We can evolve our intelligence and our consciousness as human beings, because play increases our creativity. I'd say that play also increases inclusivity, because play is universal. It's a leveler. Everyone can play. And I mean, AI doesn't know what it was like to play as a child. And some of the most inspiring leaders I know are playful leaders. So what does it feel like to be with a playful leader? It feels like savoring life, filling your day with different enjoyable things, and it can inspire great thoughts. So I think it's crucial for leaders in these next years to look for those ways in which we are unique and we can add value over and above. And there are many of those ways, if only we look for them.
And I love that. I love that story, because that sounds inappropriate, right? So you're distracted from your work by this, whereas actually, as you point out, it makes you better at it. And so as I think about where you're pointing us, we need to double down on being human, get the best out of ourselves. And so that, to your point around the models that we have in place, the way, I think about the working day as a concept. That's a sort of homogenous, well, we'll all go to work between these hours, and, presently, well, I'm not necessarily doing my best work when you think I ought to be doing it, because that's not how it works. And so it seems to me there's a great opportunity here for us that, in a way that the technology should allow us to be more human. And what I think you're pointing towards, and correct me if this is wrong, is to say we need to really start doubling down on being this is the cliche, right? The best version of ourselves as a species.
Yes, that's right. And doubling down is a good word, because it points to intentionality. It's so easy to get addicted to this wonderful tech that's coming out in many ways. And of course, in many of these tech companies, their business model is predicated on us being well addicted to the offerings that they're putting out. So for us to be intentional about creating those spaces in our lives, many of us spend the 8 or 10 hours of a working day hunkered over our laptops in the brace position. We've got the blue light coming at us from the screen, and the shoulders are hunched like mine are now when I'm always adopting this position to describe it. Whereas we could decide once per week, as a very practical tip, once per week to go for a walk for 60 to 90 minutes, a slow walk, and not take any notes with you, and see how your thoughts settle. Don't go with a particular agenda. When I've done something like that, I've found that the creativity tends to start to flow. And also after that 90 minutes, I feel fueled up for hours. And 90 minutes is about 1% of the amount of hours we have in the week. I mean, 1%. So it's not a massive investment, but the leverage is huge. And I think that's where the advantage is for us is, as you say, to be more distinctively human.
And I was struck by your comment about AI not experiencing childhood, which hadn't occurred to me. It's very, very astute. But it also occurs to me that if I think about the idea of sort of digital immigrants, i.e. those of us that are old enough to remember when the internet wasn't really a thing, and digital natives, and what kids nowadays are growing up with expectations, and take a kid and show them a rotary phone and they'll go, what the hell is this? Whereas you and I will just about remember how to use those.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether we're almost in a position where leadership experience in this world where we're having to shift to dealing digital, that lack of experience may well mean that certain leaders who could have, to put it in simple terms, may have been good in the analog world, maybe less good in the digital world. And I'm wondering about, is there a challenge here with the lack of experience that people have in handling it, that we're already starting to see where we get certain older people who are not so good with technology, and as their businesses become more digital, or in fact are entirely digital, are stranded slightly. And the generation that doesn't like people working from home because I can't see what they're up to. Seems to me that those dynamics could be even more exacerbated with the sorts of things you're talking about.
Yes, they could. And if we approach the topic of who has more experience, I think it works in two directions initially. And even this may be being simplistic, but you could look at younger people who are digital natives and they have more experience working with this technology naturally as part of how they've grown up. And so older people can learn from them and need the humility to recognize that. Equally, there is deep wisdom in having experienced a world before it was so connected as it is now. And much of what I'm talking about in these pathways of cultivating stillness, embodying intelligence, creating environments where others can really think for themselves in a non-distracted way. We actually know a lot of this deep in us, and sometimes the technology can pull us away from it. So some older people have deep experience in these other things that we need as well. So everyone can learn from everyone else. I think the heart of it is what I call mature consciousness. And this is a big pathway in my book. In fact, it's the one I work up to. It's at the end of the book when I imagine a world where AI has achieved not just AGI, but super intelligence. And I say, even in a world like that, where AI is so much better than it is today, what have humans to add? Like, won't all of our capabilities get usurped? How will we be useful? And as I imagine that world, I realize that there is still value we can add by being as mature as we possibly can in our consciousness and embracing a world where there is chaos, where we don't know all the answers, loving ideas that are not our own, encouraging others, cultivating humility. This will come down to the people who are the most mature in their consciousness, the most mature in their adult development. That's not how good are you at creating a spreadsheet? How accurately can you write a legal document? These are capabilities that are going out fast from human distinctiveness. But it's these abilities to create a playful environment and be at ease with what others are thinking, even if it's very different to your own.
The good news here is that the robot overlords are going to not take everything over, provide, as long as we develop these new. I guess the bad news is that in many respects, and I view this as quite exciting, but I'll sort of paint it in a negative light just for fun, is we're going to have to learn some new stuff now, right? This starts to get, if you decided to sit this one out, I'm just going to continue to do what I've always done, that's going to be problematic from what you're saying. So there is a sort of retooling, if you like, of the way that we think about things that we're all going to have to go through. Otherwise, implicitly, there's a bit of, well, what are you here for?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Retooling. And in one sense, plus ça change. It's always been the case. We've needed to retool and get with the times. When a new technology comes along that's highly disruptive, it's tempting to think, well, wow, this is a complete game changer. The world will never be the same again. And I think it's probably always true. And some people are saying now, there's an article recently by Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt talking about how this is an epochal change with where AI has got to, epochal of the scale of the industrial revolution. And maybe that's true as well, but certainly retooling will be needed, will be essential.
And of course, one of the things that I'm struck that humans are very adaptable. We know that. And we've seen, we're all capable of things we never thought was possible. And we can see that happening all around us. But equally, we hate change. And I wondered, as you're thinking about your leadership models, how does that sort of challenge play out? I mean, is this any different to other leadership challenges that people face? It require, there'll be certain dynamics that some people find easy. Does this require a shift in terms of when you're working with your clients and sort of thinking about leadership challenges? Is this a game changer in that sense, or is this again a case of plus ça change?
I think it is a game changer. The largest clients in the world, you see a lot of disruption out there. You see a lot of large businesses whose very business model is getting threatened. For example, with the emergence of something like ChatGPT, look back 10, 20 years at giants like Nokia and Kodak and see how they failed to meet the moment. I think that there is a stillness at the heart of the most effective responses to these challenges. I actually look at the response of AstraZeneca at the start of the pandemic, and they developed a vaccine and didn't take a wholly profit maximizing approach and offered a vaccine that was actually relatively cost effective. And they've had a tremendous impact in terms of number of lives saved. What's interesting is what created the conditions for them to take such a bold approach. For a while before the pandemic, they'd had various roadshows and other initiatives within the company that allowed people to take that time to think deeply about a purposeful response. So they had that sometimes ingrained in the culture. That will be very important going forward. So as we listen deeply to CEOs and business unit leaders and heads of learning, and as we design leadership development programs, increasingly we're equipping leaders to navigate complexity, to be comfortable with ambiguity. What we spoke about earlier about the what if scenarios with the models, to be very effective at working with those. So there are changes coming. It's different from a lot of the training and development that we saw at the start of our careers.
I remember that fondly. And one of the other things that strikes me is when we look at leaders, you would sort of think C-suite as an example. But one of the things that technology also enables us to do is leaders will appear in different guises. And of course, we've always had people, if I use the term influencer, we've always had people who've been able to influence from the sidelines, from positions that not necessarily positions of authority, but they've been able to exercise influence. A court jester is not necessarily the most senior person in the room, but they will have a disproportionate ability relative to their status in society. And I think we can start to see other examples of that technology permits people, through, for example, social media, giving voices to people that might not otherwise have it. The voice of the consumer versus the company, for example. And as I think about the democratization of information and some of the other things that AI points towards, we can all make ourselves a lot smarter. Is the traditional leadership model going to remain in the sense of all of the power being vested in big offices? Or is there a potential for a different form of leadership model? In other words, people holding different positions, having leadership, people with different attributes, and that the structures that we have in place now, are those fit for purpose going forward? Or are we going to find changes in that?
Yes, there is an opportunity to collaborate with AI in a different way than we've been able to collaborate with technology before. And so I think that will usher in some structural changes. At a simple level, some businesses, and maybe it was a PR thing initially, but they've played around with having an AI board member. Generally, it's been a case of a board with 7 or 8 people, and the AI has 1 vote and not the casting vote. So there's some information there. And also the AI has not been put in charge of the highest level of strategic planning. It was more of a subcommittee level, the example that I saw. So there could be structural changes that come about based on a more collaborative approach. I don't see any changes happening very quickly now. I think with some of the court jester type ideas you brought up there, there's an opportunity and there's a danger at work here. I think the opportunity is that some voices can be amplified much more quickly, and you see through influencers, and that can be a very good thing. Billie Holiday once said, if I'm going to sing like someone else, then I don't need to sing at all. And so there's an ease that people can have in saying, look, this is my voice. I want to bring this to the world. And they put it out there on one of these channels and can gain a lot of influence, whether they're 17 years old or 77 years old. So that's a real opportunity. I think the danger comes then if we hand over too much control to AI. For example, a danger in terms of bias. It's well known about the biased data sets that have been given to some AIs. And there's one example that I saw where the data set was 33% biased, in the sense that women were 33% more likely to appear in photographs related to cooking. And that was the data set that was given to the AI. And what's interesting is that machine learning didn't just mirror that bias, it amplified it. So you've got the 33% bias to start with, and then the neural network that was trained on that data then predicted that a person cooking was 68% more likely to be a woman, even if that image was the image of a balding man in a kitchen. And you know me, you could see me, and anyone listening to this podcast can Google my name and see my photo. I love cooking Indian curries in the kitchen, and I'm a bald man. So this example resonates with me. And that is a potential leadership nightmare out there, because you're trying to make decisions, you're trying to structure your organization well based on the data that there is, and the data's biased, and then you feed the data in, and pops out, it's even more biased. It's a recipe for disaster.
Pun fully intended. And that data set point is interesting. And for me, the mind blowing moment was reading Caroline Criado Perez's Invisible Women, which I'll put a link to in the show notes of people, which really looks at the fact that there is, it's a data. So discrimination is in many respects, certainly systemic discrimination comes from a lack of data, but we can see that on an individual level where people are suspicious of people that don't look like them or they've never come across before at a sort of primeval level. But I'm wondering, how do we fix that? Because clearly it's sort of, racing ahead, and we've got this classic tech challenge of people are doing things because they can rather than necessarily because they should. And so we've seen what happens with social media when people race ahead and, we didn't quite realize it was going to do, and it does it on a massive scale. And we know that human beings get carried away with things. And, that's even if they're trying to be ethical, let alone if they're not. There's an inherent challenge here, I guess, and as I sort of think of the top of my head is on the one hand, the data challenge isn't going to resolve itself. On the other hand, a human propensity to race ahead and assume that more and more AI will be the solution to everything. So this is very risky territory, really, I guess, is what you're pointing towards, because we can't change who people are, and we can't deal with that absence of data.
That's right. And I think the solution lies firstly in a deeper understanding of the problem. And then there are some helpful directions I think we can immediately take. And in terms of what is the problem here, I think if I have a viewpoint about you that is filtered and that is somehow homogenizing, it limits what you're capable of in my eyes. So if I'm saying that you're like me, or I'm representing that you're exactly like me through some data set, then in some deep way, I am interrupting your ability to contribute as your full self, because you do bring a diverse set of experiences. You are different from me in many different ways. And if we cherish that difference, we add quality to our thinking. So this sort of homogenization, that's a myth. Homogeneity is just not real. What is real is diversity. So when we understand this at a deep level, including across our data sets, then I think, a couple of helpful directions people can take are firstly to be aware of the filters we have. We all have filters. We make simplifications. And so to scrutinize those, be aware of those, recognize them. And then another one would be, as people, to make a promise to each other at work. If you're there at work right now, promise to be more fascinated in what other people are going to say than you are frightened by being proved wrong. Often I'm sitting there with my experience and I have a point of view, on the data. And I'm like, yeah, if I really listen to you, if I really allow you to speak and express your point of view, at some level, I'm like, you might actually say something really intelligent and that convinces me. So then I just interrupt you and I carry on expressing my point of view. So we can have that courage to be more fascinated with where you're going to go with your thinking. Then we're creating these environments I was talking about, these independent thinking environments.
And one of the things I love, it screams out in all of your writing is that, we can have better conversations. And so if I look at, one of the reasons I find doing a podcast fascinating, and particularly with this format, is I'm listening to what you're saying and I'm thinking and I'm reflecting. And sometimes that leads to questions that aren't as succinct as they might be if they were sort of, pre-programmed questions I thought about for ages. But that's not the nature of human conversation. And I love the fact that in amongst all of this, and it's logical from all the things you said before, is you're really driving towards actually we can be better at some of the things that, some of the traditional skill, active listening is something that we are, in many respects as kids, we're taught to listen. So there's sort of, make sure you listen to other people and listen to teachers and listen. I mean, sometimes it's a bit sort of patronizing and it's an opportunity for people to fill children's ears when they can't fill other adults' ears. But parking that, your point, there's quite a delightful future where you're saying we can have better conversations with each other, which will also help us deal with some of the challenges of technology. And I, for me, that was a really positive thing to grab hold of.
Yes, I call it paying magnificent attention. And sometimes the levels of listening that people are taught are at the lowest level, I'm not listening to you at all. Then there's a level that's a little bit higher that I'm listening to you on the surface, but I'm just pausing to reload. And while you're talking, all I'm doing is preloading what I'm going to say. And I wait for the nanosecond gap in what you say. And then I'm straight in there with what I was going to say already. I'm not really listening. Then a level higher, which we're often taught is the best level, is listening to reply or listening so that I can then contribute in a certain way. So I am listening to you. I'm nevertheless really waiting for my turn and wanting to say what I want to say. There is actually a level of listening that's higher than that, I would say, which is where I am drivingly fascinated with what you are going to say next. And I'm thinking, how much further can you go in your thinking, Christian? And how much further than that? And how much further even than that? And everything about me, the way I'm sitting, the way I'm looking at you, the way I'm interacting in the conversation is encouraging you to go to as yet unexplored heights of your thinking. That's my focus. And I've been in groups where the whole group has had that mindset. It's a very powerful experience where everybody's encouraging everyone else. And what you find after a while being in that setting, the first realization is, wow, I've not been in a setting like this before. I'm not usually in this kind of setting. Well, you're actually interested in what I'm thinking. You actually care about that. It takes a while of that being your environment before you then do settle into thinking at a higher quality. So there are, I think, in boardrooms, in cafeterias, in the shops, in the homes around our world, there are great opportunities for us to deepen and enhance the quality of thinking that we're doing.
And it strikes me, when you talk like that, meetings aren't set up to work on that basis. Government, in many respects, if I look at the UK Parliament, right there, we have benches opposing each other, and we talk about the opposition. And so if I think about the way meetings are run, if I think about the structures of conversations, a lot of those things, I won't say it's necessarily deliberately designed to exclude that, but it does sometimes, that's almost the effect sometimes. And so you're talking here, I guess, not just around people changing their perspective and approach, but we're going to need some changes in structures here to be able to accommodate some of these processes. We need to do things differently.
Yes, the British parliamentary system is very adversarial. There's a great video online of the Ditchley dialogues in 2022. I can send the link so that you can include it in the show notes. And it's between Peter Thiel and Herman Hauser. It's a fascinating discussion because Herman makes the point about the Oxford Union Society, so not the Cambridge Union Society that I led, but the other one, but they're basically the same. They're debating societies. And really the aim when you're a student there debating is to win the vote. And whatever you can do to win the vote, that's really all that matters. And in fact, the pinnacle at such a society is to win a vote where you have taken a position that is so ridiculous, so outlandish, so obviously untrue, and yet you win the vote. So all about this persuasion without really trying to make progress. So the structures, I think, do need to change away from that kind of dialogue to a dialogue that is much more thoughtful. And you mentioned meetings. I think here's one tip that many people could benefit from in terms of their meetings, which is to frame agenda items as questions. And I see all the time agendas going out with things like budget or marketing report listed as agenda items. And you look at it and you go, what does that mean? I mean, I don't have a clue. Whereas there's something about a good question that invites the human mind to start playing with it. And certainly it will help some of the potentially more introverted types who like to reflect on the agenda before the meeting to engage better with the agenda if they see it with questions. If these questions can be powerful, generative, open questions, not just trite ones, all the better. But just to frame those items as questions will, I think, improve the quality of thinking in meetings.
I love that idea. And I'm giggling because I've been in not too many meetings where you sort of, if you were just given the agenda, one, it's no different to the previous meeting. And you sort of, so you get in that kind of Groundhog Day repeat thing, but it's like, God, it's dull as well. And so I love that idea of we like asking questions and being asked questions. And that's super simple. So if nothing else, I love that. That's absolutely brilliant. And speaking of questions, one of the things that it sort of occurred to me is to get the best use out of, let's just take ChatGPT. One of the things I discovered when I interviewed it, and I'm intrigued to see how it interviews me in a future episode, but is that in order to get the best out of ChatGPT, you have to start being a lot more deliberate about how you ask questions. And so I've seen many people go, well, this is a bit rubbish. And you should look at it and go, well, you asked it a really primitive question. You gave it no context whatsoever. And so the best results from that come from being much clearer, giving context, doing things that we don't normally do. And so I think it's interesting when you point to questions as being a powerful tool, there's a good example, I think, and you suggest this in your writing, is that tech can actually help us in that regard. I've got to brief ChatGPT in a way that makes no presumptions because it doesn't know anything in terms of what I'm looking for. Whereas a human being, I could probably issue the instruction much more quickly. And so I'm intrigued as to how some of the tech is going to help us do this. It almost force us to do this in the way that we interact with it will help us in our interactions with each other.
Yeah, that's right. And we're talking about collaborating well with the tech again. And I think this is going to be an increasingly important theme. Sometimes you can pick up in the media or on some of the documentaries about AI, a battle theme, humanity versus AI. A lot of the films that relate to AI can pick up on that. It's a very entertaining theme. I actually think we're already pretty integrated with AI. I think about the iPhone that many of us have, that mine is less than a meter away from me right now and is less than a meter away from me for much of the day. And AI fuels a lot of what's in that iPhone already. And there's not really a far jump from where that iPhone is sitting to it being an implant in me, some sort of software, hardware interface. So the integration of humanity and AI, some people call it techno-humanism. It's not a long way off at all. We will be collaborating anyway. And so, yeah, I love the question you asked there about how we collaborate with it will be a determinant of success.
You've been on a fascinating, makes it sound like one of those sort of singing competitions, but let's talk about your journey. But you've been on a fascinating voyage, let me use a different word, or adventure, maybe, discovering this piece. And I can see the book has come from your natural curiosity. Knowing you as I do, but also knowing what's in it, this isn't a case of sort of, I'm going to write a book because it's sort of like, I find this really interesting and I'm going to go and think about things and explore. And the book is almost a vehicle to explore that and share your thinking and your experiences. And so I'm assuming that you are very much on a longer adventure here and that this is purely the start of it. And therefore, I'm guessing that the moment you put the proverbial pen down on it, there's loads more stuff that you could have put in there. Is that how you see this as well?
Yes, it is. And what's interesting about writing a book is the moment it's released, and it was released on the 28th of February in terms of globally, Kindle and audiobook, and actually NFT apparently,
Wow.
and then hardback at various dates after that. But yeah, the thing is, once it's released, I as an author lose control over it. In one sense, I die in terms of my link to it. But then there's a sort of a rebirth with me now being part of the conversation. But then so is everybody else. It's just out there. So I'm really interested to see what will become of it, what people will make of it. I think the story continues for me largely in that my life purpose is to help leaders flourish and to help organizations thrive. So that's what my colleagues and I go around the world doing in terms of developing leaders and programs at scale. And AI is really part of the atmosphere now, and increasingly so. So it's good that I've had a think about this, and many others are thinking about it as well.
Are you raring to go with the next book, or are you just going to take a little bit of time to see how this one goes?
The answer to that question is that my wife says that I should never write another book again. I'm so grateful to her for some opinions she gave on early drafts of the writing. And also we have 3 kids and sort of managing the family, and a weekend when I'm writing, and then the next weekend I'm writing. It was a real team effort to produce this book. And I'm a very slow writer as well. I'm not one of these people who can write 1,000 good words in a couple of hours. Not at all. It's slow for me. I redo the draft, redo it again. It was really iterative over a period of years. So it was a big effort for me, actually. And I don't feel like writing another one very soon. And let's see whether I 100% listen to the dear advice of my wife.
Fat. I'm not going to challenge you on that, mate. Very sensible advice. And look, it's been fascinating talking to you. And I think as people will have detected, you are incredibly thoughtful. And I think there are so many sparks that you have just sort of lit with the way that you talk about things. And I love the fact that you point out things which, when you've realized them, you go, oh, that's really obvious, or I would never thought. And I love that. And so I want to say thank you, firstly, for just being an amazing guest on the podcast, but secondly, just the way that you think. It's very infectious and it's very curious. And it's the antithesis to go back to the story that we started with, where you talked about sort of, potentially not being in the moment. I think you're very much making up for lost time, should we say, if there was any lost time. And it's an absolute joy to hear. So I want to say thank you for the work that you're doing. All of the things that you've put out, I just find always engaging, always thought-provoking. And as people who've seen on the show, there's an incredible brain at work there that is very, very human and very, very curious. And I think that's incredibly compelling. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Christian. I really appreciate those words. And I've very much appreciated during this conversation that you have been deeply present and forming your own thoughts and your own questions in response to the conversation we've had. So yeah, I encourage you to keep on thinking deeply about leaders and the future as you are. Thank you for inviting me on.
Amazing. Before I let you go, Nick, remind people, firstly, how they can find you, and secondly, what the book is called and who it's published by.
Yes, certainly. You can find me on LinkedIn under my name, Nick Chatrath, or on my company website, artesiangroup.co.uk. The book is called The Threshold, Leading in the Age of AI, and Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Waterstones, everywhere's got it. So The Threshold, Leading in the Age of AI.
Links to all of those things, as ever, in the show notes. Nick, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And from me, thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Nick for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Nick, his work, and his new book, The Threshold, Leading in the Age of AI, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. My regular reminder that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out soon and available for pre-order now. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. If you've missed any of the previous episodes of the show, have a look at humanriskpodcast.com. You can find details and links to them there. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, watch out for the AI, and don't be scared of it. It can help us. But in the meantime, stay safe, enjoy your interactions with AI, and thank you so much for listening.